Hello everyone, welcome back to Heart Rate Based Training. Again, my name is Tim Fleischer and this course is brought to you by the ACSM in Polar. This is part 3 of our 3-part series on heart rate based training, so this will be the advanced techniques. Let's go ahead and get started. Here are our objectives for this seminar. First, utilize basic heart rate respiratory muscle training. So we're going to look at respiratory muscle training and how we may be able to apply it to a heart rate based training program. Next, we're going to learn how to adjust heart rate programming based on different variables. So we'll explore some of the variables like altitude training and things like that. And then we'll finish up with learning how to utilize heart rate online programming platforms. So platforms such as Training Peaks and Polar Flow, and just give you an intro into some of those platforms to get you started. So our first objective is going to take up the meat of the seminar today, and that's going to be learn basic heart rate respiratory muscle training, or RMT. I pulled this out of the Wall Street Journal a few months ago. There was an article in the health section on how playing the harmonica had some health benefits for individuals with COPD or emphysema. And that made a lot of sense to me because a lot of these individuals with emphysema, they can get air into their lungs, but they have a tough time getting it out. So deep exhalation exercises are going to be very appropriate for those individuals. And so these individuals get together in groups and they play the harmonica and probably some other instruments as well, and just really that force them to breathe and focus on their breath a bit more. And I thought it was interesting that they were saying they were feeling much better. And so we want to see if we can take that kind of thinking and apply it to maybe endurance sports, and see if there's any benefits for athletes utilizing respiratory training. So that's what we're going to explore today. So we want to talk about the breathing anatomy first. First off, your diaphragm and your intercostal muscles are very important in respiration. And I'm talking about just quiet breathing. So as you inhale, the diaphragm and the external intercostals in particular, they help to get air in the lungs. So what the diaphragm does is when you take an inhale, the diaphragm, which sits at the bottom of the rib cage, it's a dome-shaped muscle. So when you inhale, it descends and it spreads out. Now what this does is this creates a vacuum to help pull air into the lungs, as well as it creates space in the rib cage for the lungs to expand. The intercostals help to upwardly rotate the ribs, so they pull the ribs up, the external intercostals that is, and also create that space. So that you may notice when you take an inhale, you may sit up a little taller, and if you take a real aggressive inhale, you'll sit up a lot taller. And the reason for this is because your rib cage is expanding and those intercostal muscles are pulling up on your ribs as well. Now, as you exhale, particularly when you're increasing intensity in exercise, let's say, your deep muscles like the transversus abdominis and the internal obliques, they'll start to assist with forcing air out. So they assist with forced respiration. During quiet respiration, when you're just sitting there, usually what happens is the elastic recoil from the diaphragm and the intercostals opening up the ribs, it's enough to kind of get the air out on the exhale. So when those muscles relax, the air will come out. Well, as you start to exercise more and more, you start to burden other muscles to get the air out, in particular the transversus abdominis and the internal obliques. So the rib cage, we want it to be nice and mobile, not stiff and rigid. So we don't want these muscles tight. We want these muscles nice and loose and limber. And so when you inhale, you want to see that rib cage expand, and when you exhale, you want to see it compress. Now, as you start to tax the musculature more and more through, let's say in our case, we've been talking a lot about endurance training, so through swimming, cycling, or running, as you start to train aerobically and increase that intensity more and more, you're going to be putting more burden on accessory muscles. So more muscles are going to be getting involved to help get air in and get air out. And this is where you start to see some issues. So your neck muscles, it can start to contribute. So you have these muscles called your scalenes, and they're active during quiet respiration. But when you When you start to really tax your musculature more, they become more and more active. And then muscles like your sternocleidomastoid get involved. That's another neck muscle, which we'll talk about in a bit. Muscles like your shoulders, your lats, your quadratus lumborum, any muscle that attaches to your thoracic cage can facilitate in getting air in or getting air out, depending on the muscle that it is. So if you're really taxing your respiratory system a lot, I'll give you an example. You go out to the track. If I take a walk out to the track at the University of Texas and I watch a track practice and I see somebody out there running 100 meters and they have their shirt off, at the end of that 100 meters they're usually bent over and hands on the knees, and you can see every muscle in their back start to flare up and trying to assist in helping getting air in. That's what I'm talking about there. So if your respiratory system isn't functioning properly, or you have weak muscles or whatnot, you may start to see some dysfunction go on. Now, this isn't a rehabilitative course by any means. We're just trying to bring awareness to how we can use this in heart rate training, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But it's very important that we're familiar with the anatomy of the diaphragm, just muscles that are involved in quiet respiration, as well as your deep abdominal muscles that help get the air out. So we want to keep that in mind. Now, we talked about the autonomic nervous system being an important part in heart rate training and how it can affect heart rate. Well, when the sympathetic nervous system speeds up the heart, so we talked about the fight or flight mechanism in the foundations course, and then the parasympathetic will help drive the heart rate down. So, when we're breathing, okay, this can totally have an effect. And this was a study that was done just looking at breathing exercises in human volunteers. Now, these volunteers were not exercising at the time, so I want to be clear about that. But I found it interesting that by performing breathing exercises regularly, this study showed that the heart rate post-exercise went down in those who were performing the exercise, just the respiratory training exercises. And I wonder if that can be applied to, let's say, an athletic population. So I think a lot of work needs to be done here, but what I'm suggesting is maybe the athletic population wants to start having possibly just respiratory training exercises. And you may say, well, why would we just do a respiratory training session? And we'll go into why that is now. So if we talk about respiratory training, the goal is usually to keep the heart rate low. So we're trying to utilize breathing to drive the heart rate down. So yoga, Pilates, gyrotonic, all utilize respiratory muscle training. They give particular emphasis to how you move with your breath. So I'll give you an example. I can only speak to Pilates specifically, although I do know that yoga and gyrotonic utilize respiratory muscle training throughout their sequence of exercises. In Pilates, what we'll say is for a sit-up, I may say something like, inhale to prepare and nod your chin, exhale to curl up your spine, inhale to stay put, and then exhale to lower back down. So every single movement in Pilates is going to have a breath sequence, and that's what I mean by these methods tend to pay much more attention to respiratory muscle training than maybe other traditional strength training methods. So the idea is that we're focusing on deep exhalations to recruit those abdominals to force the air out and build intra-abdominal pressure to provide stability. And then while focusing on deep inhalations into specific regions of the lungs to have a successful exercise. We'll talk about why that is here in a minute, but when I say the goal is usually to keep the heart rate low, we're going to be trying to drive heart rate down with respiratory muscle training. We've been talking about elevated heart rates a lot in this course, but now we're going to start to explore, well, what happened? How can we lower our heart rate, and what are the possible benefits of that? Well, number one, with endurance athletes, they tend to have very big rib cages. If you look at a Lance Armstrong, for me, I look at swimmers a lot. I was on the deck at the most recent Texas Winter Invitational meet, and I saw a lot of the Olympians out there swimming, and they all have these really big rib cages, and you wonder why that is. Well, they're constantly taking deep inhales, and I always wonder, are they taking deep exhales with those inhales? So are they able to get all the air out? So one of the specific goals is we want to focus on deep exhalations to allow the diaphragm to relax. When you inhale, the diaphragm depresses. Remember, the rib cage will open up and expand, and the intercostals, the external intercostals, will help to upwardly rotate the rib cage and lift. So when you exhale, all of that should depress and the diaphragm should relax. Well, if you're doing an intense bout of exercise, let's say you're out doing sprints, or you're in zone 4, zone 5, you're doing a hip workout, or even zone 3 work, zone 2 work even, are you taking adequate exhales? Usually we're taking a decent amount of inhales, so we want to get that oxygen in, but are you burdening your body to get the air out of the lungs? And that's important. So one of the things we want to do is relax. One of the consequences of that deep exhalation is diaphragm relaxation. With that, we're going to be able to get the abdominals, those deep abdominals, more involved to help assist with getting the air out. So we're going to strengthen the abdominals, not just as core stability muscles, but as respiratory muscles. And I think we need to draw some attention to that they are important. Those deep abdominals are very important in getting air out and building intra-abdominal pressure to stabilize your spine and pelvis. We also want to relieve any unwanted, unnecessary muscle tension. So I talked about the neck and shoulders and how they can get involved a lot. Well, we want to make sure that those muscles are taxed as little as possible, because that's not their primary role. We want to make sure that we're utilizing the deeper muscles that were meant for respiration as much as we can, and then as those accessory muscles need to come in as exercise intensity increases, so be it. And we also want to have control over the breathing. So not just slow, methodical breathing, but we want to focus on all different types of pacing maybe. Maybe there's some benefit to all of that. I'm going to focus much more on the deep exhalation and the benefits that lie within that. But the point is we want to promote control over the breathing. So there's an article out that's available on Google Scholar and PubMed.gov that's for free, that you can get, called The Value of Blowing Up a Balloon. And it talks about building in abdominal pressure and helping to relax the diaphragm from a much more of a physical therapist's point of view, but it's something that you may want to incorporate with your athletes. Blowing up a balloon, you're able to draw awareness to the breath, number one. Number two, you're able to build intra-abdominal pressure to strengthen your abdominals as respiratory muscles through blowing air into the balloon, and take unwanted tension off of accessory muscles. So it's a great tool to help utilize. It's a great tool to use. It's very inexpensive. I go to Walmart and I pick up a bag of balloons for $1.87. I put them in a jar. When I have clients who come in for a Pilates session, they grab a few balloons and we get started. And one of the things I want to do with them is to help them relax, help start to use their abdominals as a respiratory muscle, and to relax their diaphragm. So it's a great place to start to strengthen the abdominal muscles as respiratory muscles and to relax the diaphragm. So I'd encourage you to check out that article. There's specific goals. Well, what do we do when we have the balloon? Can I just blow it up anywhere? Well, one thing you want to realize is where your diaphragm attaches to. So your diaphragm has attachments in the lower thoracic and in the low back, in addition to the ribs. So one of the things that you want to do is make sure that you're comfortable and you're not burdening it as, let's say, a postural muscle, okay, something that keeps you upright, because it can do that. So you usually lying on your back or something like this will help to relax that muscle. So a supine position may be quite appropriate for to help relax your diaphragm. A side-lying position can be great because it'll help release hip flex tension. So, something where you can just focus on your breathing, bending the knees into 90 degrees of hip flexion, 90 degrees of knee flexion. Or a 4-point kneeling position could be quite good. A 4-point kneeling position is great because it's going to make you use your abdominals just by the position alone. So if you have somebody blow up a balloon in this position, then you're able to, it's going to load your abdominal wall right away. You're going to be able to feel those abs just by the position, and then you're going to be able to utilize those abs as respiratory muscles when you start to blow up the balloon. So you have sideline hip flexor relief, 4-point kneeling, loads the abdominal wall. Supine, it's comfortable on the back and easier to relax the diaphragm. It helps, now, it also helps build an awareness as to where you are in space when you lie on your back. And so when we talk about directional breathing, we'll talk about proprioceptive feedback. Now, this is just, for our purposes, what we want to know about proprioceptive feedback is this is the feedback that your body gets neuromuscularly, so knowing where you're at in space. So it's spatial awareness. So when I lie on my back, I can feel my back against the floor, so I know where my back is in space. So, you know, with your clients, one of the things you can do when you're teaching them how to breathe is you can provide feedback on where to direct the breath by placing your hands on their back. Where would you want to do this? Probably specifically in the posterior lateral areas of the ribs. Why is that? So that's the back and sides of the ribs. Why? Well, that promotes you're promoting an efficient breath pattern because that is where gas exchange takes place in the deep posterior lateral regions of the lungs. So that's where we want to direct the breath. You have these little sacs in what's called the respiratory, called alveolar sacs that have veins and little arterioles wrapped around them that fill up with air and allow gas exchange to take place. Well, we want to direct the breath there so that we become very efficient at breathing and get that good gas exchange taking place. So just so you know how your ribs should move, the lower ribs should flare out to the side. They call that the bucket handle effect. So like a bucket swinging out to the sides. And then the upper ribs, they should go back and forth, almost like a pump handle, you know, like a water pump. So as you inhale, you want to feel the back of the rib cage expand, and you want to feel those lower ribs out to the side expand. That's where you want to direct the breath. So when I say pump handle and bucket handle, that's what I mean. Posterior lateral breathing, why? Promotes efficient gas exchange. Proprioceptive feedback, what's that? It's spatial awareness. How do we do that? By touch and feedback. So if your client is okay with you touching them on the ribs, then go ahead and touch the back while they're breathing. Maybe if they're on a trainer session on a bike, something like that, you can do that. Or if you're just doing a respiratory muscle training session, you can also do that. So the use of balloons is going to provide an exhalation focus, which is something you want to get good at. You want to be able to take those deep exhales, use those abdominals as respiratory muscles to help relax that diaphragm as we spoke about. Now, if you want to bring more of a focus to the inhalation and focus on getting good, deep inhalations, there are actual resistance trainers called the Power Breathe that will help provide resistance. And my understanding is some of these training masks that have come out now may also provide this resistance, although I've never used one. I do have a Power Breathe. I utilize it. It has an inhalation focus, so getting the air into the lungs. So not only can you have that proprioceptive feedback, but you can strengthen that diaphragm by taking deep inhales against resistance with the Power Breathe. And then there are tools like the Spiro Tiger, which is what you see in the picture in the background, which uses almost a metronome and has a bag on the end of it that you take deep inhales and then you take deep exhales into the bag, and it'll set a particular rhythm, say inhale for 2 seconds and exhale for 4 seconds. And you just practice that over and over and over again, strengthening your respiratory system. So you have the use of balloons, which would be much more of a abdominal focus, the use of, and to relax the diaphragm, the use of the Power Breathe, which promotes more strengthening of the diaphragm, and the Spiro Tiger, which just focuses more on the speed of your breathing. And you could set that to anything. Now, here's how it kind of relates to endurance sports. So this is a picture of Chris Froome right here. This individual has won the Tour de France a few times. He's probably the world's top cyclist right now. And if you get the chance to watch him race, cycling season's about ready to start up again, I would do it. He has a very unorthodox technique on the bike. His elbows, you can see, are flared out to the sides. And a lot of times when individuals are going uphill, they get off the bike saddle. They stand up and start to pedal pretty hard, like an Alberto Contador. He's another elite cyclist. You'll see him get off the saddle, and he looks like a snake kind of going up the hill. Everybody seems to have their own unique way of riding the bike. But this individual, Chris Froome, he looks really interesting when he's going up a hill because he stays seated on his saddle and he starts to nod his head back and forth. It looks like a bobblehead almost. So in an interview, they were asking him about that, and he said, well, I'm not just staring at my power meter when my head goes down. My gaze is a little bit lower. My neck gets tired. I'm very rounded in my upper back, and I find my neck gets tired. I find it easier for me to breathe. I can get more oxygen when my head is down, or when my head is lower down. Well, what's interesting about that quote is that he is bobbing his head from side to side, and if you know anything about that respiratory anatomy, you know that the scalenes in the sternocleidomastoid attach there. So I always wonder, is he using those muscles by bobbing his head back and forth to help facilitate getting more air in during those hard efforts? I don't know, but it's just interesting to watch, and I wonder if if these muscles are really helping get the air in, and he's utilizing that when he's climbing. I just think it's interesting that he said he can breathe better anyways. So with our respiratory muscle training programming, what do we want to do? Well, we want to train the respiratory system to functionally drive the heart rate down at various intensities. And I'll explain to you right now what I mean by that. So if I go through a pure respiratory muscle training session, let's say 30 minutes, I'm just focusing on my breathing, blowing up balloons, using the Spiro Tiger, or using the Power Breather, a combination of all three. What's that going to do for me? Well, it's going to strengthen those muscles, and it's going to build awareness of how I'm breathing. I remember taking my first lactate threshold or anaerobic threshold test when I was up in Canada. And the coach who was testing me kept telling me, as things got more and more intense, focus on your breathing, deep exhales, deep exhales, deep exhaling. You could sit there and just watch your heart rate go down as you would exhale more and focus on your breathing more. So that's the idea. That's why it's relevant to this course, is we want to drive the heart rate down. What you know is, this is important, particularly at an anaerobic threshold level. If my anaerobic threshold is at 175, let's say, and then I'm able to and let's say I'm pushing a hard effort, I'm at about 174, about ready to pass anaerobic threshold. Well, what do we know about that? Well, when I go past it, I'm going to be really close to falling off and really fatiguing fast. So I want to stay just under it, or get as much under it as I can. Well, if I can use my breath and drive my heart rate down, I can stay below that threshold. So if I'm at 174 and I start to really focus in on my breath, I can drive it down to 173, 172 at the same intensity. Well, I'm becoming more economical just by utilizing my breath. That's huge. So that's the real value here. So as you increase the pace of your breathing, this is going to increase your heart rate. So being able to control that breath under load is going to be very important. Now, longer, slower breathing is going to help to decrease heart rate. So there's an individual. So you may want to, do a 15-minute workout, and let's say inhale for 2 seconds, exhale for 5 seconds, or something like that. So that way, when let's say you go out for a run, you're more focused on both inhaling and long exhaling. There's a famous author, Jack Daniels. He always promotes a 2-2 pattern. So for every 2 steps, take an inhale. For every 2 steps, take an exhale. And then you want to try and exercise that out. So maybe for every 3 steps, you take an inhale. For every 3 steps, you take an exhale. So focusing on your breathing during your running sessions, during your cycling sessions, or during your swimming sessions, anything that we're talking about from an endurance aerobic perspective is going to be very important. Position is also important with this. So remember, more abs in the 4-point kneeling position, less the back muscles in a supine position. So if you have a client, let's say, who has a very tight back, a very big rib cage, and isn't very flexible, maybe you want to start them out just lying on their back with some pillows under their legs and have them blow up a balloon to try and relax the diaphragm and help them to connect with their abdominals a little bit. Side lying position, 90 for hip and back comfort, so you can bend those knees in, you can flex those hips in and just relax and focus on your breath there. You can provide that proprioceptive feedback in a side lying position with your hands or by wrapping a TheraBand around their rib cage. So we want to train the respiratory system by itself and then emphasize it during your other modality training, i.e. running, swimming, and cycling. So this is very applicable to runners, cyclists, and distance swimmers, focusing on longer inhalations and exhalations at various intensities. Understand that as intensity increases, the need for those accessory muscles do as well. All right, so the more intense that you're training, the more that those bigger muscles that are meant for other things are going to come in and help get air in and help get air out. So we want to take the burden off them as much as possible. Again, just a reminder about running, the 2-2 rhythm. That's from Jack Daniels. That's not from me. So focusing on your breathing during training outside of your respiratory muscle training is going to be very important. Long breaths, deep inhalations, deep exhalations, and most importantly, you build an awareness of the breath and control the breath. All right, so here's a picture of some respiratory muscle training that I'm doing with a client. This individual has a very big rib cage, a very stiff rib cage. He actually has a very big lung capacity. He could have been an opera singer. He was also a professional. He could have been a professional trumpet player. He happens to be a sports announcer on TV for motorcycle racing. And what we're trying to do here, we're doing a move in Pilates called the short spine. And what we're doing here is you can see straps going up to his feet. This picture on top. He's relaxing his low back muscles, he's relaxing his hips, and he's blowing up a balloon there. Now, I have him moving here. I just don't have him in this position not moving. He's moving through a specific move, but he's focusing on his exhales, focusing on his breath. We're focusing on mobilizing his ribs, so I have him put his hands on his stomach and around his lower ribs so he can give himself some proprioceptive feedback, some spatial awareness to where his rib cage is in space. You can see in the bottom two pictures as well, the one picture his legs are supported in the strap, he's blowing up a balloon as he lifts and lowers his legs in the straps, and then on the picture in the far right hand corner there, he's postural resting exercises focusing on relaxing his hips and blowing up the balloon. One of the reasons you want to relax your hips, by the way, when you're doing these specific exercises, and the reason hip comfort is going to be so important is because so has muscle, which is a deep hip flexor and a spinal flexor. It attaches to the lower thoracic and lumbar regions of your spine. This is important because your diaphragm has a blend-over kind of attachment down in that area as well. So your hip flexors can affect your diaphragm. So when we're trying to relax the diaphragm, what I'm saying is we want to try and relax the hip as much as possible. If you're an endurance athlete, you're going to love this because your hips get used a lot. So just a little post-rehab trick, relax your hips when you're focusing on your respiratory training and it'll go a lot better. Now here's another position where we're trying to work on strengthening his rib cage, or getting mobility in his rib cage, strengthening his abdominals, and you can see in the upper left-hand corner picture, we have him blowing up a balloon, although it blends in with the window there a little bit. I have his elbows on the ball, and I'm trying to get him to round his back. I see he's lost a little bit of mid-back stability. You can see his head goes slightly there, but this was just a picture we were doing. And in the picture on the right, you can see him flexing his spine, reaching with his arms, trying to relax his hips in this position, stretch out his low back, and direct his breath and we're trying to facilitate his abdominals, again, his respiratory muscles. In the lower left-hand corner, this is the Spyro Tiger being utilized with a heart rate monitor from Polar. So this individual is looking at breathing into the Spyro Tiger, training with a heart rate monitor, trying to drive the heart rate down as they're performing a respiratory training session. So hopefully that provides you with a lot of information, a lot of good ideas to incorporate into your heart rate based training program that you may not have considered before. It's a different way to utilize heart rate. Kind of, you don't necessarily have to use heart rate within those respiratory muscle training sessions, but you want to use respiratory muscle training to draw awareness of how to drive down heart rate when you are in heart-based sessions, i.e. swimming, cycling, and running in the various zones which we've already described. Now, we want to learn how to adjust heart rate programming based on different variables. So let's talk about that a little bit. Well, let's do a quick review. First, heart rate is a real-time physiological measurement of aerobic intensity. We talked about that already. Recovery heart rate will decrease with increased aerobic fitness. So we talked about that. As you become more fit, you're going to be able to recover faster. We talked about the biathletes and how fast they can drive their heart rate down after cross-country skiing, and so that they can take a focused shot on a target. Resting heart rate will decrease with increased fitness. So as at rest, your heart rate will be lower as you increase your aerobic fitness. Utilizing all training zones is beneficial. Remember, we spoke about how it may be tempting to go out and just do a lot of high-intensity interval training, but there are risks involved in that, and it all depends on your goals as to whether or not that's appropriate. We talk about what's appropriate, what we believe is appropriate is training in all zones, and all zone training is beneficial. So we don't just want to fall in love with, say, zone 2 because it's the fat oxidation zone, and we don't want to fall in love with this zone 5 because we're able to work out really hard and get a lot of, metabolic benefits there. Look at the benefits of all zones and try and sprinkle them throughout what's appropriate for our given goals. And then, number 5, breathing patterns will affect your heart rate. So understand that the way you breathe is going to affect your heart rate. So as a coach, as a trainer, it's very important that we focus on breathing and controlling breath from the perspective of teaching an individual how to utilize heart rate programming best. So what other important heart rate variables do we have to talk about? Well, the importance of a proper warm-up, number 1. Number 2, we're going to talk about cardiac drift. Number 3, we're going to talk about overtraining and overreaching a bit. And number 4, we're going to talk about the effects of altitude on performance. So warm-up, we've spoken about this a little bit, but I just want to come back and make sure that we have an understanding of what we want to do in a warm-up. The goal of the warm-up is to elevate the core body temperature. So we want to increase blood flow to all the muscles that we're going to be utilizing. Now, when we talk about warming up in Pilates, a lot of times people will ask if it's very similar. It's not at all. A warm-up in a Pilates or a mind-body situation like yoga, it's not so much about elevating your core temperature as it is just getting you neuromuscularly connected, i.e. making sure that you have all that awareness of where your body is in space, because these are very movement-specific exercise modalities, so they focus on movement initiation a lot. Well, what it doesn't do is it doesn't increase your blood flow. So if an individual comes up to me and suggests doing a yoga workout or a Pilates workout to get as a warm-up, that's fine, but please understand that that's not going to get your heart rate where it needs to go. We want to get the heart rate up and increase blood flow. It also is going to prepare the lungs to be stressed. So, and in addition to that, one thing a warm-up does is it potentiates the muscle. Well, what's that mean? Well, basically what it means is it gets more muscle involved, and so that when we're ready to race, or train, we have all the muscle that we have all the muscle that we're getting ready to use ready to go. So if you think about muscle potentiation, think almost the opposite of fatigue. Where fatigue, you're getting really tired. In muscle potentiation, you're getting all these motor units fired up. So a motor unit is the motor neuron and all the fibers that it innervates while you're getting all these, while you're utilizing, you're getting all these muscle fibers fired up, those small muscle fibers, those larger ones to kind of help out in the workout that you're getting ready to do. Okay? Now, what should be included? Well, if we take those things into account, you know, these can be various time lengths between 10 and 20 minutes for novice people and intermediate people. More advanced people may include, you know, a zone 2 10-mile run for a warm-up. That does happen. So, and it is appropriate for those individuals. So it depends on the activity, but give yourself at least 10 to 15 minutes at least to warm up properly. So what should you do? Well, do some zone 2 work. Okay. So do some of that light, just a light jog to start things out. You don't want to get injured. You don't want to pull a muscle, so just a light jog, and then gradually build up. You know, you may want to add in some sprints in there. We talked about getting more muscle involved and ready to go. So maybe a few 25-yard sprints to get up into that zone 3 area a little bit. And then you want to address all planes of motion. Remember, even though we're primarily moving on one plane, you're stabilizing on all planes of motion there. So your sagittal, your coronal, and transverse plane, particularly in the run. So you want to make sure that you're warmed up on all these planes. So maybe some side skipping is appropriate, maybe some rotational exercises appropriate through your thoracic spine, and as well as running forward and backwards. So all of those things can be utilized to help your body warm up and get ready to work out. So you can also warm up with some respiratory muscle training. Why not, right? Here's a recent article that just came out on respiratory muscle-specific warm-up in elite swimming performance. So these individuals used something similar to a power breathe to help warm their respiratory system up before they went out and raced a 100-meter freestyle event. It showed to improve their time a little bit, so I think more work needs to be done in this. But warming up the lungs with, you know, maybe you take a few balloons out or you take your power breathe out to the park with you when you're getting ready to work out. Take some time to warm up your lungs, your respiratory system, get those muscles potentiated and ready to go. Cardiac drift. So this refers to an elevated heart rate that occurs with prolonged exercise with little or no change to a given workload. So this is something that happens from time to time, and you just want to be ready for it. Really, what happens is during cardiac drift, your core temperature is increased, and you know you feel like you're going at a low pace, but you can't control your heart rate. It just seems to keep going up and up. It's a sympathetic response because you know your heart rate goes up as a result to stroke volume going down. So remember, from our first seminar, we talked about stroke volume being that, you know, the amount of blood pumped per beat. Well, when that goes down, your heart's going to have to work harder to pump more blood. So the sympathetic response is it's going to speed up the heart rate. I was out on a bike ride with a friend who's a well-trained cyclist, actually, and we were going out for about a 4-hour ride, and this individual looks out, and it was a Zone 2 ride. We're just talking, riding out on the road in Austin, and he said, we're about 2.5 hours in, and he said, oh, I got some major cardiac drift going. We were going really slow the whole ride, and all of a sudden you start to see his heart rate go up to 173, 174. His effort wasn't great at all, and he was a very fit individual, so it didn't correspond with the work we were doing and his effort and his fatigue level. So, but we still have to be careful when this happens. So what should you do? Well, understand what's happening first. Focus on your breathing, try and drive the heart rate down. Make sure that you're hydrated and fueled. Remember, we talked about dehydration being a big problem and how your heart rate can go up if you're not hydrated appropriately. But what I would recommend above everything is you need to rest at this time. So call it a day at this point, and I think it's the safe way to go. If you have clients who are experiencing this, tell them that they need to rest and call it a day. Okay, so overreaching and overtraining. Well, what's overreaching? It's an accumulation of training resulting in short-term decrease in performance where restoration of performance may take several days and weeks. So this happens to all of us, by the way. As you train more and more, you may find a day where you've had a big training volume and you just don't feel right. You feel crabby, you don't feel like training, and then you notice that when you get on a treadmill or you get on a bike, you get in the pool after your warm up, you're just not able to get your heart rate elevated high, but your effort level feels like a 20. So that may be a sign of overreaching, where you just need to take a day off. You need to rest and relax. Overtraining is when this really happens for a long period of time, weeks and months, and I've heard in some cases years. So, you know, all of us are going to overreach at some point. Hopefully we don't experience overtraining to the level where we have to take months off. But you know, if you've got a running season coming up or a race season coming up, you know, and you just finish up and you're tired, maybe it's not the time to really push it. You want to take your breaks, make sure you're resting appropriately in both these conditions. If you want to know more about this, there's a good article available on Google Scholar at pubmed.gov. Does overtraining exist? It's an interesting article, and I believe most certainly it does. You just want to make sure, I think the solution is we really just want to make sure that you rest and you don't overdo it when you are in a state when you're overtrained. Usually this goes with, you know, psychologically you just feel tired and you don't want to go, and then you just have a tough time getting your effort level up. So recognize, just like the cardiac drift, what's happening and that you need to rest. Altitude training. So altitude training is an interesting topic. Remember I spoke about going up at altitude and racing in Leadville. If you have a race, and my best advice to give you in the races at altitude, and you live at sea level, like I live in Austin, if I'm going to go race in Colorado, I think it's appropriate to go up there a few weeks early, if possible, to get acclimated. I think the earlier the better. There's some in the literature that says, you know, you go up the night before, it won't have as great an effect. I'm not comfortable really making that recommendation. I would suggest that get up there, get acclimated, get used to the thin air, and then go and perform your race. So I think it varies. It's different for different people, though. You know, you'll find that a lot. So I like to err on the side of conservatism with this, and so the earlier you can get up there, the better. And I would recommend, you know, you get up there at least a week to 2 weeks before the event. So, you know, now if you live at altitude and you can train at altitude, you know, that's great. You know, as you come down, they say, you know, you want to live high and train low. So you're able to go more intense at sea level, but you're able to have greater metabolic adaptations at altitude. So your body will respond much better, and you'll see an increase in performance at that altitude. But you know, training where at sea level, you will be able to go more intense. So if you have an area where you can live, you know, at elevation, then you can come down and train at a lower altitude. That's really preferable. So just you know, here's kind of some times you see performances at sea level in the world records for men in selected altitudes. You see at sea level, you've got a marathon and it's run at 2:06:50, and you see, you know, the higher. Basically, the idea is the higher you go in race, the slower those times are going to get. Okay, now so race low and live high. Okay, so learn how to utilize heart rate online programming and platforms. Now, this is something where we're going to briefly go over, but it's very important, and I'll give you some links at the end that'll help, where you can find more information. So common platforms are like Polar Flow, which is if you get a Polar watch, then you'll get a free account to Polar Flow, and you can upload all your activities to it. They have Polar has a YouTube channel with an introduction to Polar Flow on it you can check out, and you can find more information on it at the Polar website. It's great for the general population. If you have a client, you can get on there and interact with the client so they can upload their workouts. You can actually get on there and look at the workouts as well and provide feedback. Now, Polar has an agreement actually with Training Peaks where it's integrated. So Training Peaks is kind of a gold standard website where if you're a serious endurance athlete, you want to have access to something like this. because you can upload all your workouts to Training Peaks. You can look at your volume. You can see they've got algorithms on there to show you how fatigued you may be, how much, how fit you may be. And so if you really want to get specific about your training and really look at all the variables that go into your training, then Training Peaks is a great solution. So here's what Polar Flow looks like, just a screenshot. And I've showed you a few screenshots. And you can just kind of see how, these websites are great to show you, to keep you from overtraining and overdoing it. And you can see on the left there, strained, balanced, and undertrained. So when I get into that strained area, maybe it's time to take a break and reassess and just make sure I don't get hurt or injured or anything. So you can look at how much work you're putting in per week. You can look at the type of workouts, how many of these workouts you're doing, and just keep track of that, which is really nice. Now with Training Peaks, and like I said, Polar is integrated with Training Peaks, so you can use Garmin with Training Peaks and other devices as well. They have their own algorithms for fatigue and training stress, so that you can peak for a race properly, and you can keep yourself from overtraining. So they call this a training stress score, or TSS. This is the stress from training for one exercise session. Okay, and they give it an amount of points for this. So let's say, for example, my functional threshold power, the amount, for let's say cycling, for my FTP test, or going as hard as I can for 1 hour, let's say that's worth 100 TSS. Okay, so it's the stress from one exercise session that you'll get in. There's TSS for swimming, cycling, and running. Well, the 45-day weighted average of this training stress is called your chronic training load. So this is a measure of fitness. So what's your training load over 45 days averaged? And that's going to be your chronic training load. So let's say that I have a 45-day weighted average, or average of about, let's say, 110 for my CTL, or chronic training load. That would be my 45. So that means for the average TSS I had per day for that 45 days was what I just mentioned there. Now, acute training load, this is your 7-day average. So this is an acute, shorter time period. So this is going to give you a measurement of fatigue. So if I have 120 for my chronic training load, and then my acute training load is 150, so in the short term I've been training a lot, then it gives me a measurement of fatigue. Well, how do I know this? Well, all I do is subtract my CTL, my chronic training load, from my ATL, and it gives you a measurement. Now, the current thought is that if you get to plus 30, you're losing fitness with your training stress balance, which is CTL minus ATL, and if you're negative 30, you're getting really fatigued and you may want to take some time off. So if my CTL is 120 and my ATL is 150, that gives me a negative 30. Maybe I need to take a little time off and rest a little bit. Or if my CTL is, let's say, 150 and my ATL is 120, then that would give me a plus 30. Then maybe I'm losing a little bit of fitness there relative to where I'm at. So you just kind of want to keep that in mind. So that's how you kind of look at it. Now, you have something called your intensity factor, which basically it tells you how intense your workout was. So it gives you a nice number for how intense your workout was to give you your TSS. So how does this work? Well, if we look at, this is called a performance management chart. You see the main line here with the blue underneath it. That's my CTL over time. The yellow line is going to be my training stress balance. So remember, that's going to be ATL, or that's going to be CTL minus ATL. And the ATL, the acute training load, is the pink line there. The dots, the red dots, those are individual workouts, so those are the TSS during those workouts. And how intense those workouts are those blue dots, the intensity factor. So what I want you to appreciate about this is that if you look at as the ATL goes down more and more, the training stress balance goes more to the positive. As the as ATL goes down sharply, you start to see the CTL go down with it, but not quite as sharp, because remember, that's a 45-day average. As the ATL goes up, you're going to start to see the CTL go up more and the training stress balance go down. So if you look all the way to the right, you can see that I had a huge training load for a short period of time. My ATL went way up. My training stress balance went way down, and so it was in the negative. My CTL went up, and you see I took a break right after that. So my ATL dropped, and my training stress balance went up. So it gives you an idea of where you're at physiologically, so that you don't overtrain and that you peak right for your events. So they have a lot of good webinars for training peaks on their YouTube channel, and on their website they have a lot of good information. So I'll give you those websites at the end here. Now, they also have a program called WKO4. This is something that I personally utilize. WKO4 has, it's a more advanced way to look at your training. So you can build your own charts and graphs based off your training and look at it in great detail. You can manipulate and look at different things. You can control for altitude. You can look at power duration curves, pretty sophisticated things. And I just want to introduce it to you to let you know that all this data is being managed with these websites. And so we want to be able to correlate and utilize these tools with what our clients are expressing to us psychologically and try and marry them together the best we can. Just like we talked about at the very beginning, the importance of bringing data in with what our clients are taking us and making sure that we're getting a correct interpretation of what's going on. So here are the resources for those online platforms. You can go to trainingpeaks.com. You can also go to polar.com to look at Polar Flow. And like I said, the Polar units are integrated with Training Peaks. So I take my Polar watch, I upload it to Polar Flow, I look at it on Polar Flow, it automatically goes over to my Training Peaks account, which I have, and then that'll update my Training Peaks and WKO4 software. If you're interested in any of the articles we've gone over, you can go to www.pubmed.gov, and you can put the title of these articles, which I've listed, in the search engine. Okay, so in summary, we've learned about the basic heart rate respiratory muscle training. All right, so hopefully this gives you a little base to go off of, something new you could add to your heart rate-based training. We've learned how to adjust heart rate programming based on different variables, and we've also learned how to utilize heart rate online programming platforms a little bit, just an introduction to get you started. So I hope you enjoyed the seminar. Remember, there will be an exam on this information, so you want to make sure that you're studying for it. And thank you again. I look forward to hopefully seeing you sometime in the future.